William B. Eerdman's publishing company presents Toughest People to Love: How to Understand, Lead, and Love the Difficult People in Your Life. Written by Chuck DeGroat. Narrated by Scott R. Pollock. Introduction. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. John chapter 15, verse 1. We keep bringing in mechanics when what we need are gardeners. Peter Senge. You're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and heart, put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. Matthew chapter 5, verse 8. The Message. Organizational guru Peter Senge wrote one of the best articles on leadership I have ever read. People who know me are aware that I'm generally suspicious of so-called leadership experts. But Senge proposed what seemed like a Copernican revolution in leadership, one that toppled the unquestioned principles of management and organizations. He argued that organizations are in fact organisms, living things, like gardens. Challenging modernist leadership assumptions that promote rigid, hierarchical, and mechanistic work environments, Senge envisioned a relational and soulful approach to leading people, one that struck me as wise and much needed. Senge also challenged the sacred authority of the CEO, the unquestioned and invulnerable leader who leads by control and compliance. He advocated for a new kind of leader, one who is relational, vulnerable, humble, willing to learn, and to even fail, one who leads by integrity rather than manipulation. Since I was a young leader myself, Senge's words struck me to the core. Deep change comes only through real personal growth, through learning and unlearning. This is the kind of generative work that most executives are precluded from doing by the mechanical mindset and by the cult of the hero leader. The hero leader is the one with the answers. Most of the other people in the organization can't make deep changes because they're operating out of compliance rather than out of commitment. Commitment comes about only when people determine that you are asking them to do something that they really care about. For that reason, if you create compliance-oriented change, you'll get change, but you'll preclude the deeper processes that lead to commitment, and you'll prevent the emergence of self-generated change. Again, you end up creating a kind of addiction. People change as long as they're being commanded to change, or as long as they can be forced to change. But as a result, they become still more dependent on change that's driven from the top. As a recent seminary graduate and a new pastor, I felt as if I had received a vision for pastoral ministry that had never been articulated in seminary or through my internship process. In my work in a small business and then during my years of seminary studies, I had observed many leaders. Most of them were very strong, but they seemed insecure. They thought it was important to lead from a posture of command and control, but they seemed deeply afraid to be questioned or to fail. Senge says, "We keep bringing in mechanics when what we need are gardeners." As I read his words, it struck me that Jesus had similar things to say. Critiquing the rigid, hierarchical Phariseeism of his day, Jesus turned leadership upside down. Empowering the seemingly incapable, telling stories of vineyards and fields and sheep that needed the self-sacrificial tending of the soul gardeners. Jesus, in other words, was not a command and control leader, but a gardener of souls. Now let's face it, command and control works, at least for a time. It gives leaders that all too elusive sense of control, particularly when they feel they're in over their head. Most of us, I suspect, don't want to be leadership bullies. We'd prefer not to lead with an iron fist. But when we feel the inevitable internal chaos that comes with leading people, we default to what seems to work. Most of us are not skilled in the art of leading broken and wounded souls. Perhaps you picked up this book because you were having a difficult time of leadership yourself, hoping it might give you a bit more control amid the chaos. Perhaps you, like me, crave the ultimate handbook for understanding and fixing people. This is not that book. Instead, I'm offering a bigger vision for human relating, one that might even allow you to relinquish the need for control. Eugene Peterson's wonderful memoir, Pastor, reminds us that we're called to be contemplative, not competitive. People are not problems to be fixed, Peterson suggests, but image bearers to be known. As contemplatives, we turn our focus to seeing God in the ordinary moments, in the broken lives of people, and in our own humanness. We lead from a posture of self-sacrificial love, the deep secret of God's kingdom, instead of from a posture of competition, control, and manipulation. If the soul is a garden to be tended to, as all of God's good creation is, then we must approach the garden with a sense of sacred awe. People are profoundly complex, both beautiful and broken, productive and paralyzed, fruitful and foolish. In my work over the past 15 years as a pastor, a seminary professor, a therapist, and a church leader, I've been tempted in my worst moments to see only the problems and failures. Surveying the broken body of Christ, I sometimes opt for the quick and easy cosmetic change rather than the hard work of soul gardening. Too often, I've abandoned sacred awe for cynicism, self-protection, and fearful reactivity. The best leaders I've talked to admit the same. In this book, I will address the dark side of people. But I'm convinced that in God's economy of grace, nothing is wasted. Not our failures, not even our big sins. In our darkest hour, the Father sees us and runs wildly toward us, arms open in joyful compassion. Luke chapter 15, verse 20. He doesn't fear our sinful chaos. Rather, the great gardener sees an opportunity to cultivate us, to grow us, to renew us. Jesus transforms our little deaths of failure and sin into redemptive opportunities for growth and renewal. As Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." John chapter 12, verse 24. Our failures are often opportunities for new beginnings. The best leaders, wounded healers. One day, I decided to Google my name to see what was being said about me in cyberspace. While I was clicking through various blogs and websites, it dawned on me that none of them included references to my painful failures and disappointments. Of course, that wasn't what I had Googled my name to see. But the real truth about me cannot be found on websites and blogs, not even those I write myself. Who I am today is a composite of many things, from my DNA to the various people in my life to my struggles and failures. I've made it a bit of a hobby to study the stories of great Christian leaders, with a special focus on the painful struggles in their lives. I think of St. Augustine, who rehearsed his life of sexual addiction in his famous Confessions, or St. Teresa of Avila, who experienced years of prolonged spiritual dryness, or Charles Spurgeon, who battled such severe depression that he was frequently unable to preach, or Catherine of Siena, whose chronic illness was no small factor in her becoming a rare female Christian leader in 14th century Italy. These people remind me to consider my own story, my own difficulty, before presuming to engage the struggles of others. Perhaps that's why I was so drawn to Lincoln's Melancholy, a biography of Abraham Lincoln by Joshua Schenck. The fact that Lincoln was depressed and at times even suicidal is widely known, but I found myself gripped by the particulars of his story: failure, a broken relationship, an imperfect pedigree, a genetic burden. And yet Lincoln's own woundedness, the author argues, brought healing to a nation. When I read Henri Nouwen's The Wounded Healer as a young seminary student, I wondered why a seminary professor would want us dwelling on the morbid and unhelpful topic of our own pain. Surely I had better things to do: study Greek, learn how to preach, master biblical exegesis. Little did I know that my own brokenness would be the conduit of much more healing in the long run. I hope this book is a product of hard lessons learned. I pray that we'll all be compelled to love others, not as those who have been to the mountaintop and are experts and mechanics, command and control leaders, but as leaders who know our own brokenness and who have found a greater wellspring in God's deeper love. A roadmap. So, what will we explore in this book? In Part 1, we'll explore the basics of how people work. The first chapter, A Vision for Those We Lead, A Vision for Ourselves, sets the tone for the rest of the book. You'll notice that I won't let you off the hook if you're someone who is in charge. In fact, I'm convinced that leaders are called to examine ourselves very carefully as we attempt to figure out others. Don't read on if you're not ready for what you'll find when you turn the microscope on yourself. Chapter 2 is entitled, Understanding Our Story. This is psychology for the layperson, and we'll learn that there's much more to human beings than meets the eye. Every good leader I've ever met is a closet psychologist. In fact, many leaders thrive on understanding what makes people tick. It's always humbling when we recognize what is happening beneath the surface of a difficult person. In Part 2, we'll explore the theme of leading and loving difficult people. We begin in Chapter 3 with a basic introduction to personality disorders. Have you ever dealt with a narcissist? How should you handle the drama addict in your church? We'll explore the more common disorders with an eye toward helping others while maintaining some sense of sanity ourselves. Chapter 4 is titled, Addictions, Loving in the Dark. Rarely have I found pastors and leaders more confounded than when they're dealing with addicts. There is a twist in this chapter, a new way of thinking about addiction that I believe will revolutionize the way you approach the addict's despair. Chapter 5 presents a model for dealing with the most difficult people you'll face. I call it Loving the Fool when relationships turn ugly. In it, we'll summarize everything we've learned thus far in 3 major categories that reveal the heart of a type of person the Bible calls the fool. Part 3 assumes that the best help we can give another person is to deal with ourselves, and so I invite you on that journey. In Chapter 6, I share my own story in a chapter I've titled, Growing Through Pain, The Gift of the Dark. We'll discuss the ancient idea of the dark night of the soul by looking at one of my own dark nights. We often wonder whether God can do anything with our own darkness, and the good news is that God can. Chapter 7 is called Living with Wholeness, Rest and Resiliency in the Leader's Life. Wholeness, I believe, is a deeply biblical concept. It has been wrongfully relegated to the category of pop psychology, so I use the great 19th century preacher Charles Spurgeon to help revive it. If you've ever been challenged to keep the Sabbath, prepare to have your categories blown apart. If you're exhausted, prepare for some refreshment. Finally, we end with a chapter titled Growing into Leadership Maturity, Self-Care and the Art of Shadowboxing. It is vitally important that leaders care for themselves. But take note, self-care includes honest self-assessment. I borrow the term shadowboxing from a favorite writer of mine to talk about a way of exploring our own lives for the sake of leading others.